Praise the Lord. We're going to read Acts chapter 7, verses 9 all the way to 18. And we'll entitle this, All the Brothers of Joseph Were Laid in Abraham's Tomb. And it says, And the patriarchs, moved with envy, sold Joseph into Egypt, but what God was with him, and delivered him out of all his afflictions, and gave him favor and wisdom in the sight of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And he made him governor over Egypt and all his house. Now there came a dearth over all the land of Egypt and Canaan, and great affliction. And our fathers found no subsistence. But when Jacob heard that there was corn in Egypt, he sent out our fathers first. And at the second time Joseph was made known to his brethren, and Joseph's kindred was made known unto Pharaoh. Then sent Joseph and called his father Jacob to him, and all his kindred 75 souls. So Jacob went down into Egypt, and died he and our fathers, and were carried over into Sichem, and laid in the sepulchre that Abraham bought for a sum of money of the sons of Amor, the father of Sichem. But when the time of the promise drew nigh, which God had sworn to Abraham, the people grew and multiplied in Egypt, till another king arose, which knew not Joseph. Again, we're reading verse number 9. It says, And the patriarchs, moved with envy, sold Joseph into Egypt, but God was with him. Stephen is relating the story to the council at Jerusalem. Since he was chosen as one of the 7 who were supposed to be helping the widows with their food at the tables, he dedicated some time doing so, and maybe through that there were miracles that had happened. Howbeit, somehow he had offended the council because he was preaching and teaching of Jesus Christ. Nevertheless, in any way, he seemed to have received an inspiration at that moment in front of the council to bring up a historical lesson. The council members may not have known him really well at all, and where he had been raised, and so on and so forth. But the words that he had spoken were direct and to the point. God was using his speech as a testimony to the council members, as they had been testified to by the apostles and here by Stephen. They had previously been told by the apostles that they were not going to cease teaching and preaching the name of Jesus. That made the council lividly angry, no doubt, at what they were doing. And according to their beliefs, as they believed not in Jesus, they were more keen on persecuting the Christians, basically starting off with Stephen. Here they had found another one, a Christian, who seemed like he was not afraid to speak about Jesus. Stephen was very bold in front of the council members, did not care who was on the council or what they had thought or what position they held in Israel. He knew in whom he had believed. He was determined to testify and not be silent of Jesus Christ. He mentioned the patriarchs, something that both groups acknowledged were their forefathers and those who had served God. However, what they had done to Joseph, we can say, was uncalled for, with their jealousy and envy in part of the brothers, insomuch that they were thinking of killing him. Instead, though, of killing him, they had sold him into Egypt and kept the money for themselves, telling their father a lie by presenting him with the coat of many colors. That was stained with blood because they did that, intending to get their father to believe that he had been killed by an animal. They had kept that a secret throughout all of those years, not intending to tell their dad anything. Not even Reuben, who was not sure really if they had killed him, but he knew or must have known that an animal had not killed him. He himself did not tell his dad what they had planned and what they had intended to do. Even though the patriarchs had sold Joseph into Egypt, it was God's plan from the beginning to work things out, for it does specify that, quote unquote, God was with him. That meant that through the patriarchs, that though the patriarchs had done evil against Joseph, most assuredly, and even though Joseph was not a wicked boy, they had harmed him because they did not like the way his own father had treated him better than any of those had treated him. And the fact that Joseph had told his dad everything that they had done wrong, that just made things worse. And then adding on top of that the dreams that he said that they would be bowing before him, they had had enough. Joseph must have learned from that experience greatly. God helped him learn from his ways too. And then being sold into Egypt, of course, there were many afflictions that he had gone through. Verse number 10, it says, and delivered him out of all his afflictions, and gave him favor and wisdom in the sight of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he made him governor over Egypt and all his house. Here it mentions whose house it was. It was, in essence, Pharaoh's house. That meant that Pharaoh, because it was his house, could easily make Joseph a governor for what Joseph had done for him. But it was God that had done it for Joseph. Joseph just represented God, and Pharaoh was delighted with the news. God was in the dream, for he had planted it in Pharaoh's mind, making him forget it. In other words, it was God that was doing the action there in his mind. It was all set up by God. At the beginning of verse 10, Stephen mentioned that Joseph was delivered out of all his afflictions, and that meant his latter years of life were very fruitful and much easier. For the afflictions were, in essence, gone. His afflictions were those that he had faced in Egypt and away from his family. At first, he was sold to Potiphar, who highly respected Joseph and made him in charge of all of his house. But Potiphar's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph. And Joseph tried to get and excuse me, and upon Joseph and tried to get him to lay with her in the bed. But that would have been for the life of Joseph. In other words, he would have died for that. And albeit in the end, she blamed him, even though he had not done a thing. So Potiphar, hearing the story, put him in prison. And Potiphar must have realized that maybe it was true that Joseph was innocent because he didn't kill him. He probably would have had he believed the story. And in that situation, Joseph probably had the worst part of his afflictions. Not knowing when he was able to get out of that prison house, being there, he felt like a nobody on the planet. He was a special boy to his dad, treated with much respect. But all that seemed to end with his afflictions in the prison. No longer seeming to feel like a special guy on anymore. But God was with him, the Bible says. And so God helped him and with the people that were in the prison and the one that was in charge of the prison felt that they could trust him a lot. Of course, the way that Stephen had mentioned that God had delivered Joseph out of all of his afflictions, it seems like a very short time, but in truth, Joseph had suffered in those afflictions for at least 13 years, from the age of 17 all the way to 30. But it wasn't until the age of 37 or thereabouts that he was able to see his brethren again, then later his father. He unfortunately was never able to see his mother again, so that was a sad part of the fact that he was sold into Egypt. But throughout it, in any case, it came out better than before. In his latter years, especially after the age of 37, he was not only able to see his family again, all except for his mother, but he was also able to rescue them from the famine in the land of Canaan. In fact, in reality, Joseph, ever since he had left the prison, had become governor in Egypt, was basically no longer afflicted like he was previously. He had a wife, he had two sons, was governor without anyone going against him. He was rich, he had many servants, was the one who made the decisions concerning the food. He had a job, he had responsibility, he was respected throughout Egypt. Everybody did basically what he said. However, in Canaan, during the time that Joseph had become the governor, all of a sudden, Canaan, before having great prosperity, but 5 years into that prosperity, in other words, from the age of Joseph was the age of 30 till he was 35, there were 37. Yes. So let me back up here a minute. It was actually 7 years of famine that 7 years of plenty, and that was probably all over the world, in Egypt as well, in Canaan, 7 years of plenty. So Joseph became the governor when he was 30 years old till he was 37, the time of plenty. Then 2 years in, so he was actually 39 when he saw his brethren. And so um, the affliction that came upon Joseph's family was when Joseph was 37 years old. And it was not long after the affliction started that other countries began to come to Joseph in Egypt to buy food. So when the affliction happened with other countries and even with his brethren, Joseph was becoming more famous because they had come to Egypt to buy food. And he was responsible, or they had to come to him, and he made the decision. But of course, he would sell it. He wouldn't take advantage of it because he wanted to do what was just and right. And even though actually in the beginning it seemed like God was wanting him to bless Egypt, but through that he would bless basically all the countries. And his brothers came, and everyone that came in their affliction to Joseph, he was able to help them in their affliction with food. So Joseph was no longer being afflicted. The other nations were being afflicted. They came to Joseph to help them be relieved of their affliction. So God used him in that way. So he started out being afflicted in Egypt at the age of 17, and even worse, in the prison house. However, at the age of 30, he became governor. His affliction was basically gone. At the age of 37, that's when nations started coming to him. And they were afflicted, but Joseph was not. They came to him to have a relief from their affliction. So Joseph was being used of God to help the world in their affliction, which is really quite amazing. So he had his fame grow due to, one could say, affliction. And so the time came when Joseph finally revealed himself to his brothers. And I think at that moment, at least in Egypt, his fame became greater yet. And then it may have traveled, the news might have traveled to other countries as well. So Joseph's fame was really growing. And he was a person who helped relieve the affliction of the world through God's miraculous ability to help Joseph. So, what did God do for Joseph? Well, he gave him not only favor in the sight of Pharaoh, but basically, when the affliction started, favor in the world. He also received a lot of wisdom of God, and that wisdom he used. And that wisdom comes from God when one obeys God's commandments, follows his ways. Verse number 11 says, Now there came a dearth over all the land of Egypt and Canaan, or Canaan, and great affliction, and our fathers found no sustenance. And you notice that it says in verse number 11, great affliction. Joseph was afflicted greatly before, but things have turned around. Egypt was having that affliction, but they really had food. They were afflicted in the fact that they couldn't get their food, they had to buy it from Joseph. And so Canaan also, but also the other countries were greatly afflicted. So they came to Joseph to have him relieve their affliction. Thus it is here in this verse that the affliction was over all the land of Egypt and Canaan, but everywhere too. However, Joseph himself was not afflicted at all. His affliction was gone. And he was being used of God to relieve the afflicted. Instead of Joseph being afflicted, which he had faced a full 13 years, though the world was afflicted after Joseph had come out of affliction, Joseph was not feeling the same affliction when the world was in affliction. Joseph had come out of it, was no longer going to be in affliction for the rest of his life. Instead, he was an affliction reliever. So we'll call Joseph the affliction reliever. Amen. And the rest of the brothers of Joseph experienced affliction too. They would not find relief for their affliction until they met Joseph. Joseph later revealed himself unto his brothers, and their affliction ceased. They had finally realized, or should have realized, that God was the one doing his own work in bringing the family back together again and placed in Egypt, not in affliction anymore. Really, Joseph did not in any way really punish his own brothers, but he had helped them when before his brothers had done much harm to Joseph. He was just basically testing them at the beginning. Yet it was God's way for bringing about his plan, and that Joseph could be an affliction reliever. Verse 12 says, But when Jacob heard that there was corn in Egypt, he sent out our fathers first. Of course, Jacob knew nothing of the sort that it was God's plan for him to do this. God knew exactly when Jacob was going to send his sons into Egypt. He sent all of them except for Benjamin, who stayed behind. The question might be, why didn't he just send one or two or a few of them? I suppose it was for their protection as they had traveled to Egypt to get food. Getting the food and bringing it back to the land of Canaan, and his mindset might have been he thought there might be some robbers along the way or someone who might kill them to get at their food, because most assuredly people were suffering in this famine. It was the time of affliction for them. And those who had nothing, that is, they were poor, were probably suffering the most. Therefore, he had told all the brothers except for Benjamin to go down into Egypt for that purpose, to get food, have them be able to protect the food that they had purchased. More brothers, more protection, but not Benjamin. The news had come to Jacob that there was corn in Egypt. He had probably heard of the governor of Egypt, that he was selling a lot of food because of the fact that he had saved so much in order to go through the famine, and that Egypt had plenty, not only for themselves, but they could also sell to other nations. Sell to, basically, Joseph was selling to his own brothers. Hallelujah. But really, it was free because he gave the money back. Amen. What is great is this idea. Egypt, with Joseph's governorship, did not try to dominate other nations by providing them with food and making them pay with exorbitant fees. Instead, they did things justly and righteously because, as you know, Joseph was the governor and he was the one in charge of selling the food. For Joseph was a person not wanting to take advantage of others, but to show himself kind and to do that which was right. With his brothers coming to buy grain, that was a little bit of a twist to the story, though, because Joseph really wanted to find out if they were going to help Benjamin or not, or do the same kind of activity, and that would have been detrimental to them had they done that, with Joseph being in charge of the food. The brothers did not even know that they were talking to Joseph. That was all the plan and the act of God. Verse 13 says, "And at the second time Joseph was made known to his brethren, and Joseph's kindred was made known unto Pharaoh." Without going through any of the specific details, Stephen relates the story of Joseph making himself known to his brethren. It was something that was on Joseph's heart at the right time, the right moment, so that his brothers could see that in reality the dream that he had had while he was young did in fact become true. Even though his brothers did not like that idea at the beginning, they found out that it was true because they didn't know that they were bowing to Joseph. It happened to them even though they did not want to go into Egypt and deal with the governor who they probably thought was mistreating them. Pharaoh himself was pleased of Joseph's brethren coming to see him and making it known that Joseph was the brother of those who had come into Canaan, came from Canaan. It is a wonder, though, that Joseph did not seek out his family while in Egypt. I suppose that he would not have gotten permission from Pharaoh, since he was at the head of such a grand endeavor, but also maybe God was assuring him not to go because he would take care of it. Verse 14, "Then sent Joseph and called his father Jacob to him, and all his kindred, 60 and 15 souls." Joseph wanted his brothers to fetch his father from the land of Canaan, explaining to his brothers why it was. In fact, it was due to Pharaoh's dream that he had interpreted. His brothers, no doubt, had had a good chat with Joseph. And Joseph probably had explained to his brothers about Pharaoh's dream and what it meant. He did say that there were only 2 years into the famine. Therefore, it was necessary to act quickly so that they would not become poor. Verse 15 says, So Jacob went down into Egypt and died, he and our fathers. Another encouragement that Jacob had, though, what Joseph had sent to him made him make up his mind that he would go with God. Um, God was speaking to him that particular night, too, and that was encouraging. After the arrival and news of Joseph being in Egypt had come to him and God had spoken to him, he was assured that what the brethren had said was true. He was probably so excited to go to meet his son Joseph. He had not been with him or had seen him for 20 years. From 17 to 30, that's 13, plus the 7, that's 20. 22 years, sorry. I was going on uh, the amount of just 7 years. Actually, it's 22 years. Thus, he was just overjoyed to be able to see him. Jacob had spent a total of 17 years in Egypt, um, basically in affliction. 13 years in Egypt, basically in affliction. Sorry about that. Excuse me, I'm talking about Jacob. Jacob had spent a total of 17 years in Egypt, not Joseph. I was thinking of Joseph. Jacob had spent a total of 17 years in Egypt and probably had never thought that he would spend his dying days in Egypt. However, he was delighted to be with his son, remembering no doubt of the dreams that he had had. When Jacob had heard of all that his brothers had done and all that God had done to help Joseph out, he was probably sad at one point. But when Jacob had given blessings to his sons, he didn't mention anything about the things that the brethren had done to Joseph. It was like it was all overlooked. Instead, there were things that Reuben, Simeon, and Levi had done that were different, that were not selling Joseph, but some other things that he had mentioned. But he didn't mention anything about selling Joseph as a slave into Egypt. Joseph received, one can say, a double portion in his inheritance through his children in the promised land because his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, were counted along with the other brethren. When Jacob and all of the patriarch fathers had died in Egypt, their intent was not to leave the bones of any of them in Egypt. They would, when the time came for them to leave, bring all of the bones out of Egypt. However, Jacob would be taken immediately and buried in the promised land, but the others, their bones would be taken out of Egypt later on. In fact, Joseph had made them promise to take his bones out. So they had to wait, not only to get out of Egypt, but wait in the wilderness for a period of 40 years as well until they got into the promised land. Then they could finally bury the bones. So there was a 400 and some odd years, or about 400 years, that they were in Egypt, minus their lifespan, whatever that was in Egypt during the time that they came. Then 40 years in the wilderness, and this is referring to just the children of Israel. Therefore, it may have been around maybe 400 years that their bones were taken and buried in the promised land. Who knows? But they were all taken out, those bones. In verse number 16, it says, and were carried over into Shechem and laid in the sepulchre that Abraham bought for a sum of money of the sons of Emor, the father of Shechem. The idea of verse 16 refers to their bodies or their bones that the children of Israel had carried on over into the promised land. Many might think that only Joseph's bones were taken into the land of promise, but here, declared by Stephen, the bones of all the fathers were carried into the promised land and taken into the sepulchre that Abraham had bought, and they had been laid to rest there, as we say. That was something that Stephen understood greatly and had given the history of where their bones were buried, and it was beneficial for us too to know that. Verse number 17 says, "But when the time of the promise drew nigh, which God had sworn to Abraham, the people grew and multiplied in Egypt." Here it gives us information regarding the number of the Hebrews in Egypt. In all of his speech, though, Stephen does not refer to the children of Israel as Hebrews. The Egyptians did refer to them in that way, but Stephen does not say that at all. Yet Joseph was the first one biblically to mention that he was stolen out of the land of the Hebrews. And Paul as well said that he was a Hebrew of the Hebrews. Therefore, the Israelites can be named as Israelites today as Jews or Hebrews for the language that they speak, which should be most certainly their first language. Well, at least it was back then. The time of the promise, as it states, had drew nigh, meaning that God had given that promise to Abraham, but his descendants, those from Isaac, would inherit the land of Canaan. The inheritance was not yet provided to them until the Israelites had actually entered into the promised land as a nation, not as a family only, and had conquered. And so they also had to conquer the land of Egypt. When they conquered it, then they were given it. Egypt was a place for them to grow, to multiply, as it had stated there. That is, Stephen had stated that. Verse number 18 says, "Till another king arose, which knew not Joseph." Here, it does sound as though that the one king that had arisen did not know Joseph. That means that probably the other kings that were in Egypt knew Joseph or knew about Joseph. They read their history books. They may not have treated those of that family with rigor or in slavery, but when there came a certain king that knew not Joseph, or did not even learn about the history, or did not care about learning the history of why the Hebrews were in Egypt and what they had done for Egypt as a nation, then things went sour. It seems that the Hebrews had done so much for Egypt, but in the end, the Egyptians and the king of Egypt, that is, the Pharaoh of Egypt, had mistreated the Israelites so much and had brought them into slavery and oppression very terribly. It seems that the good that had come from the Hebrews was no longer recognized, nor was it meaningful to them, but they returned, one might say, evil for the good that they had received, though not remembering nor learning the history to remember the good that the Hebrews had done for them. That is a good history lesson to learn. Those who have done good to us, we should learn to honor them, not treat them with dishonor, and try to speak evil of them, per se. And that is Acts chapter 7, 9 to 18. May God bless you in Jesus' name.